I was driving from Atlanta, Georgia to Lexington, South Carolina with my girlfriend to visit my parents. I like to drive at night since there are less people on the road and I can take my time. At around 3 a.m. or so, we are making good time. I had stopped at a gas station and picked up some coffee for us, and we were due in about an hour. The girlfriend was sleeping soundly, and I'm just listening to a quiet radio humming away. I start getting a little drowsy, and I take a sip of my coffee. There are no cars in sight, except for a spotted few on the side of the road here and there. In the distance, I can make out what looks like a hitchhiker, or what I think is one, but can't really tell due to such low light. As I get closer, though, I start to notice other things, like how the person is kind of thin and tall and completely, for the most part, apparently brown. I'm right up to this thing now, and at about 20 feet it turns around and locks eyes with me as I pass by. This was no person, and it was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. It was a deer, or I tell myself it was. I've seen deer stand on their hind legs to fight, but they still have deer posture when they do. Not only that, but I was watching this thing walk for about 30 seconds from first seeing it in the distance to passing it. The posture it had was human, standard biped stance, arms back, chin down. But the worst part was the eyes, or lack thereof. In their place were two large black pits, almost hole-ish. I'll never forget the stare down it gave me. The instant I passed it, I had the only panic attack I've ever had in my life. I actually had to wake up my girlfriend to keep calm enough to get to an exit with a large gas station a few miles away. Like hell, I was going off a ramp close to that thing. After we pulled into the station, I had a complete meltdown. I started crying harder than I ever thought I could. I couldn't talk, breathe, or do anything but want to curl into a ball and cry. After about 30 minutes or so, she finally gets me to calm down enough to tell her what happened. While I don't think she believed what I think I saw, she knew that I was convinced and legitimately scared to death. Every once in a blue moon, I'll still dream about it, wake up crying or in a cold sweat. My girlfriend will tease me about it or roll over and ignore me instead of comforting me about the one thing that I've ever been terrified of. But I know what I saw, and I know it will haunt me for the rest of my life. By far the most terrifying instance was when I was in my college dorm. It was dark in the scene, and the only lighting from the room was a thin sliver of light that came from the hallway through the bottom opening of the door. I was sleeping in the scene, and then woke up suddenly as if from a nightmare. I tried catching my breath and collecting myself to go back to sleep. Once I put my head down, my heart sank when I suddenly heard heavy breathing, and I looked over at my roommate thinking it was him and put my head down again, but it kept getting closer and louder. In my uneasiness, I scanned the room with my eyes only to see a tall, shadowy figure in the right corner, and he began laughing hysterically in a distorted and demonic fashion. I tried to scream and yell for my roommate, but I had no voice. A sudden force then laid me flat on my bed, and no matter how much I tried to get up, I couldn't. I peer over and watch the figure jump onto my roommate and literally and brutally tear him limb from limb. I try to avert my gaze, but it made me watch. I can still remember the sound of my friend choking on his own blood as he was devoured alive. Realizing that this was likely sleep paralysis, I tried to collect myself and kept saying it was almost over. But the figure now looking at me, slowly approaching my stiff body, began touching my still face with its bloody, wrenched, bony fingers. It licked my cheek and started screaming things in my ear while surrounding laughter crushed my body, and before it could escalate, it was over. In 1977, I was a 23-year-old Air Force NCO that was stationed in rural Missouri. A friend and I planned a 2-night wilderness camping trip to Devil's Den in northeast Arkansas. Late on the evening of our first night out, we discussed killing our campfire and going to the tent for the night. That's when my friend noticed 3 bright stars low on the western horizon. They were bright and formed a tight triangle. We were arguing about what it could have been when it moved. It rotated as if on an axis and began an ascent into the night sky. It was a crystal clear night with a billion stars. As this triangle climbed higher, it grew in size. The area inside the triangle was jet black, much darker than the surrounding night sky. As it passed over a field of stars, they would blink out and then blink back again when it had passed. We were not the least bit frightened. I recall a sense of calm washed over us, actually. It was almost like sedation. We were camping on a summit in a meadow, and this thing was heading in our direction. In a short while, it was directly over our heads, and it was enormous. It was a city block long on all 3 sides and 5 stories tall, as large as an office building. There were light panels on each point that ran from top to bottom, and there were hundreds of windows, and about a third of them were brightly illuminated. We could see movement and shadows behind them. It stopped and hovered in midair 30 feet off the meadow floor. There are gaps in my memory, and it doesn't play out in my mind as a seamless narrative, but rather diced up into pieces of memories. We were on board this enormous spacecraft and standing frozen. All I could move was my eyes. There were smaller gray beings herding us about. I saw a taller gray entity about 6 feet tall. He was humanoid-shaped and seemed to be in charge of these things. As I strained my eyes to the hard left, by happenstance he turned his head to the right and we locked eyes. In a millisecond, I felt it was scanning me. I felt naked. It was like it knew all of my thoughts, plans, and memories. Behind his eyes, I could perceive nothing except intelligence. This thing was raw intellect. I was in no position or state of mind to engage it in dialogue. It was absolutely terrifying. So much so that 40 years on, I still wake up screaming once or twice a year. We were transported back near our tent, and we lay watching this thing, afraid to move. It lifted off about like a hot air balloon and went straight up, and we were too scared to leave the tent until it had been gone for a half hour. I left the Air Force and completed college and law school. I made my living in the law. This was a secret shared between my wife and I for 40 plus years. All our kids knew was that Dad had bad nightmares, but that's it. If I had stepped forward and announced what had happened to me, it would have been the end of my legal career. I retired as an assistant attorney general for the state of Vermont in 2012, and I waited until 2018 to publish an account of what happened to us. I wrote a book, Incident at Devil's Den, and it's on Amazon. It tells the entire story, and every word of it is true. In the 90s, before everyone had cell phones, my Girl Scout troop was camping in a state park when a terrible storm came through the area, with major flood warnings. The rangers at the park frantically came through every campsite and evacuated everyone to higher ground. Everyone, that is, except us, and the Boy Scouts in the site next to us. We went to bed with light rain, but woke in the middle of the night to our tents collapsing from the driving rain and water quickly rising. The Boy Scouts, they were about 12 to 16 years old, we were about 7 to 9 years old, helped us quickly pack our site into our cars. Unfortunately, the roads were too dangerous to drive on because we couldn't see how deep the water was, and we really didn't know if any sections of the road had been washed out already. We abandoned all the vehicles and used the map that the scout leaders had to find some place that wouldn't be flooded. A few miles away, there were treehouse cabins that were built around a tree and lofted about 15 feet into the air. It was decided that we needed to move quickly, and that was our best shot. The older boys and the adults carried the smallest girls when it became clear that the wind was preventing them from staying on their feet. The wind and rain soaked everyone through to the skin. We made it to the cabins, and the adults then broke in and raided the emergency supplies there for space blankets. There was no way to build a fire because there was no firewood. It had been an especially dry year, and starting campfires was forbidden due to the risk of starting a forest fire. I remember shivering for hours, all of us girls in the middle of a huddle on the floor with the boys on the outside trying their best to keep us warm. One of the boys ended up asking us if we knew any Girl Scout songs. Either camp songs or more of a Girl Scout thing than a Boy Scout thing, or they were just humoring us. We ended up singing every song that we knew, and the leaders then taught us a few more songs that they had learned to keep us occupied. At some point, we convinced the boys to sing in rounds with us too. Morning came, the rain slowed down to a light drizzle, and a ranger showed up assessing damage to the park. He discovered us and immediately drove to get help. They returned with a bunch of trucks and all-terrain vehicles and drove us to a location where doctors were on site to evaluate us. It was sheer luck that none of us had anything worse than the chills. It could have gone a lot worse than it did, and we were unbelievably lucky to have survived it all. We could have easily died in our sleep if the flood had come through all at once instead of slowly rising. If the Boy Scouts hadn't have been there, then us small girls could have not made the hike to safety. If we had tried to drive, we would have easily been washed away. Two years ago, while I was tree planting out of a bush camp in Saskatchewan, it was the second last night of our season, and a few of us had been up really late drinking around the fire. After everyone else had gone to bed, I went to my tent to grab another beer before putting out the fire. As I'm getting back out of the tent, I see something running through the center of camp that definitely was not one of the dogs. I duck back inside my tent to grab a flashlight, and as I stand back up, there's a black bear staring right at me, no further than 5 feet away. I run back to the fire and wait for the bear to make a move. Luckily, he decides not to follow me. A few minutes later, I hear the bear trying to get inside our garage box. I head over cautiously, without a flashlight, like a fucking horror movie character, but I can't see the bear anywhere in the nearly pitch black. I get right next to the box, still no sign of the bear, and try to shift the box lid back into place. It isn't until the bear turns his head and I see his eyes that I realize that my hand is inches away from his back paw. Both of us, frozen in fear, stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was more like seconds. This was possibly the most incredible moment I've ever shared with an animal. I could see the intelligence in this bear's eyes, and I could see him sizing up the situation exactly the way I was. I felt a strong connection, and ultimately an understanding as fellow mammals. After this long moment, I shouted and he ran away. I stayed up until about 5 a.m., scaring him away every half hour or so, before waking up at 7 for the last day of our season. TLDR, had an incredible midnight stare down with a black bear, gained a greater appreciation for our place among animals. A lot of people that drive for a living or have done balls-to-the-wall cross-country drives can tell you about the running shadows. First time I saw them, I was on the tail end of 12 straight hours of driving. I was driving through the middle of nowhere, in the desert, and at night. Very little light from the sky, no man-made lights even on the horizon, just the pitfall cone from my truck's headlamp, and being in the middle of the desert, it pretty much only lights up the road ahead, nothing above ground level to catch the light. As I'm barreling along, I start to see shadowy figures running alongside my truck out of the corners of my eyes, on 2 legs and 4. All I can think about is the creepy stories you read online about shit that lives out in the desert, or the Asian ghost stories where if you don't acknowledge the spirit, it can't harm you. So I've got my eyes glued to the road, refusing to let them flicker off to the side. I rolled my windows up and cranked up the volume of my radio, and I drove like that for probably an hour and a half until they slowly petered out, roughly 15 minutes outside of a little one-light town. I've had many people try to carjack me, people try to rob me after I pulled over to render aid, people jump out at me on twisty mountain roads, you name it, but nothing matching the level of fear the first time I saw them. It felt like my spine was rippling like a ribbon in the wind, trying to jump clear out of my back and hide under the seat. Sleep deprivation mixed with sensory deprivation does some strange, messed up things. This dream is the most vivid dream I've ever had, as well as the most terrifying. It begins at the edge of a clear pond on a clear summer night. The sky is free of clouds, and only the full moon is casting its light down upon the crystal clear pond. The water is only about 6 inches deep, and I'm standing at the edge underneath some of the pine trees in the forest which surround the pond. By my side is my father and a silent Native American. We're all staring solemnly down at the perfectly round pebbles of all shapes and colors which make up the bottom of this mystic pond. I wade out into the water about 20 feet, and it is no deeper than it was at the edge of the pond. I'm looking down at the stones when a liquid red light suddenly bathes the water and everything around me. I can hardly describe the beauty of this light. I can only say that it left no shadows and did not fall upon, but instead permeated everything it touched. I turned to the Indian and my father with amazement of this light. Silently, the Indian turns and walks back into the forest. My father's eyes are looking up above me, and so I turn around to look where he's gazing. The moon is gone now, and there are so many enormous pentagon shapes which look essentially like nuts, as in nuts and bolts, moving towards each other. It's obvious that there is a predetermined shape that they are all coming together in a chain to form in the sky. I'm in awe at the beautiful way that they move together, and at the beautiful red light that is being emitted from them, and the area that they are forming into. As the shape begins to assemble, I realize it's essentially the shape of an eye stalk, which is large at the base and gets skinnier as it curves back and then forwards and down towards me. I look back to my dad, who is now looking at me with his eyes that convey that there is nothing he can do or will do. He looks absolutely frightened. I sense the shape of the object, and I realize it's coming towards the back of my head. As I realize this, I feel myself pulled backwards, but from the inside out. It's as if my hands gently reached inside my head and are pulling me up from the bottom of my brain. It does not hurt, but I feel intense vertigo and fear, and with the adrenaline I snap awake and feel myself fall back into my body. I remained very scared after I woke up, but after the adrenaline wore off I began to realize what a profound dream that was. Possibly almost an out-of-body experience as well. Who knows what would have happened to me if I were to let that shape take me. Last week I had this memory flooding back into my mind. I was a child, under 7 years old at the time. We went to Mexico to visit my dad's side of the family. He had grown up in San Luis, like in the middle of nowhere, by some mountain. I just remember there only being sand or dirt, no grass, and a bunch of cacti everywhere. Very desert looking. Anyway, when we got there, it was already late, so we went to sleep. We didn't all fit on the bed, so me and the other kids laid on a cot on the cement floor. Everyone else had already fallen asleep, but I was little and in an unfamiliar place, so I was still up and I couldn't sleep, and I was staring at the bottom of the door because there was some open space I could see outside, and it scared me. Then I started to see a bright, blinding white light, and there was a strong wind and dirt going everywhere, and the door opens and the light is so bright I could barely open my eyes to see, but I looked up to see two gray figures with big black eyes standing at the doorway. I got scared and I hurried up and put my head back down, closed my eyes, and I could feel them moving around at the top of my head, but I couldn't feel anything. It was so weird, I just kept my eyes closed, and the light started to fade away, and the wind started to die back down, so I opened my eyes again. The door was closed and they were gone. As a grown-up, I thought maybe it was just a dream, but it couldn't have been because I remembered the next day when I woke up during the day, I kept hearing something rolling around in my head, so I kept shaking my head and I could hear something in there. I even remember telling my mom to put her ear to my head and shaking it around and asking if she could hear it too. She just kept saying, "No, I can't hear anything, go play with the others." I'm 28 now, and I told my dad, and he believed me, which was crazy to me because he's so serious and strict, but he believed me and he said that his dad used to see them out there too, all the time. He said that they had huge black eyes, and that over there they used to look like balls or orbs of light. This made me think of that story with the soldiers who shot down a UFO, and 3 gray aliens with big eyes emerged and merged into a shape of light and turned the soldiers into limestone. It just stood out because both were gray aliens with big eyes that could turn into a ball of light. This is a long one here, but please stick with me. Last year, a friend and I went on a long road trip to New Mexico. We camped most of the way, and our first night we got to camp we spent in the Jefferson National Forest at a campsite in West Virginia. We had found some pamphlets for campsites at a gas station, and we drove out to a place called White Rocks Campground, which was like a 25-plus mile drive up a dirt road into the mountains. We were really in the boonies. On our way in, we saw no cars except for one truck that was behind us for maybe 15 minutes, but then turned down another road. We passed a huge coal factory with a sign that had said, 62 days since an on-site incident. The only people we saw on our drive were standing on the side of the dirt road, huddled around a plastic bin that was on fire. It was all so odd, but we were so excited about camping and being on this trip, we were just laughing about how weird it was instead of not being worried about having A, no cell phone reception, or B, being so deep into the mountains. We finally get to the campground, and it is completely empty. Not a single car or person to be seen, and this campground had about 30 sites. We ended up driving around all of them, trying to spot anyone, but when we realized it was just us, we picked a random site and decided to just stick it out. We got out of the car and stood there and just listened. The silence was startling. I love being in the woods. I've never felt scared or intimidated to be out there, but there was such a different feeling this time. There were no bird sounds, it was just thick, silent woods. This was straight up Blair Witch. It was getting dark quick, and we decided to start a fire and put up the tent to try to get comfortable. My friend was in charge of the tent, and I was putting together the fire. While we were trying to go about our business, we would both stop and listen. My friend made the point that if anyone was going to approach us, at least there were crunchy leaves everywhere for us to hear it coming. See where this might be going? I thought we were just freaking ourselves out, but it really felt like something was watching us. It was actually the first time in my life I've understood what that feeling is. I had goosebumps. I wanted to leave, but I kept my cool for my friend. It turned out she was also initially freaking out, but trying to keep it cool as well. Finally, the fire is started, the tent is up and sleeping bags ready, and the sun had completely set. Sitting around the fire together, the darkness seemed to close in, so close to us that it felt suffocating. My friend brought out a book to read aloud and make us feel more comfortable. While she was reading, I grabbed my headlamp and would occasionally turn it on and look around me. I had had this feeling since we pulled into the campsite that someone was out there, in those woods. It was pitch black, and our fire was a beacon. My friend and I decided, fuck it, let's go to bed. We'll just go to sleep quick, then pack up in the morning and GTFO. That was our thought process. We put out the fire and decided to grab the one knife we had on us that was still in the car and keep it beside me in the tent. After getting into our sleeping bags, my friend pulls out her cell phone to see if she had any reception. Nothing still. She tried to dial her boyfriend just in case, and I remember saying out loud, "We have no reception out here, it won't work." We laid there in silence, watching her phone trying to dial out, but it discontinued. And if that was not the perfect fucking cue, suddenly about maybe 20 feet off to the left of our tent, there were footsteps. These weren't footsteps that quietly built up. These were footsteps like someone had been standing behind the tree near our tent and started walking towards us. Those crunchy leaves were doing their job. We fucking froze. Just stared at each other, eyes wide. The footsteps continued to walk towards the tent, then turned to go behind for maybe a couple of yards, and then they stopped. Silence again. These were heavy booted footprints, with the same pattern that would be a person walking, not a bear or a deer. My friend grabbed my knife that was laying by my bag and grabbed her headlamp too. She unzips the tent and goes out and stands in front of the tent, knife out, looking around the area. She's a goddamn warrior. It was maybe 45 seconds of silence as we listened for more footsteps or voices. I could see the light from my friend's headlamp dashing around the trees, but there was nothing there. She stuck her head back into the tent and said, "We're getting the fuck out of here." And then we in record time packed up everything of ours in probably 10 minutes and flew out of there. I'm amazed, thinking back on it, how we didn't lose our heads. We kept our cool while packing, but still internally screaming in terror. We only had our headlamps on, and the whole time we were packing up, I kept thinking about how somebody would come up behind us and grab us and pull us into the darkness, and we would be completely helpless if they did. It didn't feel like it was really happening. Maybe that's why we were almost completely calm while packing. Like there's no way this is actually happening on our first night camping. We must just be freaking ourselves out. I still felt like we were being watched though, but we spat out of there once done. Now here is where it's all confirmed. As we pulled out of the campsite, there were 2 black dirty trucks pulled off to the side of the road, almost hidden in the trees but still clearly visible. They had definitely not been there when we pulled in either, and the closest residential homes were maybe 15 miles away. We didn't see anyone around them, but we didn't stop to look. We got to a motel and stayed a night there and told the story to the motel owner, who was amazingly sweet and comforting, and even gave us some cash when we left the next morning for us to use at another motel if we needed. I promised that man I would give him a good review. I will remember every detail of that night for the rest of my life. The feeling like we were being watched, hearing the footsteps so close to us suddenly, The black trucks. If anyone out there is a good writer, I would love to have someone put this into writing for me, but I'm a terrible writer and this post itself is probably god-awful. Don't go to White Rocks Campground. I was working in a summer camp, and one day when we were on minimal staff, I happened to be the only person in camp. Cell phone reception was terrible up in the mountains, so I had gone to one of the cabins to use a landline and chat after work. Heading back to my cabin at the end of twilight, I get to the flagpole and there's a large black bear. It's heading past the swimming pool, making a beeline for the dumpster. I stop in my tracks, thinking, oh crap, a bear. The bear stops and looks at me, and I could swear it was thinking, oh crap, a human. So the two of us face off for a few seconds. Either my flashlight made its eyes sting, or the bear realized my scent was all over the place. It made a right turn and ambled up the slope into the wilderness. That bear still returned on a regular basis to tip over the dumpster in hopes of getting a snack, which never succeeded because we used bear bars. So each morning, one of the chores was to lift up the dumpster and see where the tracks had come from. This scared the shit out of the kids. I ended up with the most badass reputation in camp because every little kid soon found out that I had faced a bear alone. No kid talked back to me. The one occasion where they did try, another kid stopped it by exclaiming, "That's the bear lady." I can't say I was sorry that reputation happened. Discipline was easier, especially when people noticed that when I changed cabins, the bear changed its route through the camp to avoid me. After it retreated once, its instinct thought of me as dominant, so it didn't want another conflict. All because I had stood there like an idiot holding a flashlight at a bear. Better decision than flying into panic, I guess, as things turned out. On Monday the 3rd of September 2018 at approximately 3 a.m., I experienced the craziest thing I've ever seen in my life. I had been out all evening with friends and I got home around 12:30 in the morning. I was quite tipsy and had a couple more drinks when I got in and had a game of darts. My 15-year-old son and his two friends were also at my place too. They were in the living room listening to music. My back garden leads onto farmers' fields, and over the years I've heard stories of strange lights in the sky and one of a cigar-shaped UFO hovering a couple of fields away. I am a believer, but I have never once thought that I would have been the one that was in close contact with an alien, or whatever this may have been the other night. I was playing darts and my back door was open when through the corner of my eye I noticed something pass by. The light was about 6 feet tall and went straight into the living room. I thought nothing of it until about a minute later the kids asked whether I came back on my own, which I said I did, and I had already been back a couple of hours, and I said if somebody was with me they would have known already. It was then they said somebody is in the hallway. My living room has a door to the hallway with 2 glass panels in it. They said a tall shadow moved past the hallway. I searched the house upstairs and downstairs and could not find anything. By which time my son's friends who were staying the night were so freaked out, a taxi was ordered and picked them up. After they left, I returned back to the kitchen and was just frozen in my tracks by kitchen utensils that just sat out in the air like somebody or something was holding them, but nothing could be seen. Whatever it was, they then put and dropped the utensils onto the kitchen surface, and as I made my way into the living room thinking, what the fuck just happened, my radio came on. I turned it off and everything seemed to return back to normal, like whatever it was had exited back out of my kitchen door into the garden where it had come from. Do not ask me what it was that I saw because I don't really know. I saw the light initially come past me from my kitchen into the living room. The kids see a figure in the hallway of the house, but nothing else. Could it be some sort of cloaking device? I don't know, but what I and the kids do know is that something entered the house and it wasn't human. If I'm feeling brave enough tomorrow, I'm thinking of staying up with my back door open and seeing if something else happens, but this time armed with a camera. I don't know, I have yet to decide, especially if I'm on my own. Like I said earlier, I'm a believer, and there's a huge part of me that wants to experience this again, but there's also a part of me that's slightly shitting myself about the unexpected, or what I could encounter. For any of you who have ever seen the movie Inception, directed by Christopher Nolan with Leonardo DiCaprio acting as the central character, you'll have no difficulty at all relating to my dream. However, for those of you who have not had the pleasure of watching this movie, I'll have to provide a quick summary of these parts that pertain to this particular dream of mine. Essentially, the movie is about being able to go into dreams of other people. One of the complications of this is, however, increasing confusion as to tell which is the real world and what is a dream world. I won't ruin the movie as a whole for you, but I can tell you that this becomes quite convoluted. With that said, my dream involves a similar distortion of reality and dream. The other day, I was taking a long and luxurious nap. At least I was trying to do so. Every few minutes, one of the people I live with, there are 3 in total, would do something obnoxiously loud and either wake me up or simply prevent me from falling asleep. If the disturbance continued for more than a few seconds, then I would proceed to get out of bed and nicely ask the perpetrator to try to be a bit more quiet. However, no matter how much I politely pleaded or tried to block out the various sleep-depriving noises, they continued. Eventually, my alarm went off and I was forced to get up. Needless to say, I was a bit frustrated that my nap had been ruined, so I confronted my roommates later about all the lack of consideration. They had no idea what I was talking about. As it turns out of the dozens of rude awakenings and starts that I had experienced, the only one that was real was the last one right before my alarm clock went off. The seamlessness of which my dream had flowed into reality, and the detail of that dream had me completely convinced that it was real. In fact, 2 days later, I'm still pinching myself every couple of minutes to try to make sure that what I'm experiencing is reality and not just another realistic dream. It's honestly very disconcerting to not know reality from a dream, and as I've found, can lead to some awkward encounters. Maybe there's some foolproof method to see if you're dreaming or not, but I haven't found it yet. Without it, I fear my life may dissolve into a replica of Nolan's Inception, which those of you who have seen it know will be more than a little bit strange. In my dream, I had just awoken from my sleep with the sudden urge to pee. It was still very early in the morning because upon checking my phone, I saw that it was only about 5 a.m. and the sun hadn't even risen yet. So I make my way down the dorm hallway and find that all the doors were closed, a sight that I had never come across before. Never before have I seen such emptiness, nor have I heard such a chilling silence. I find this rather eerie, so I move quickly to the bathroom door. I slide the door open, and I remember distinctly how loud the door screeched. Why haven't I ever noticed the sound it made before? It was at this moment that I realized I've been watching too many horror movies. But despite my fears and suspicions, there was no greater motivation than for me to go pee. So I make my way to the stalls, looking to myself in the mirror to reassure myself that no ghosts or demons would suddenly appear behind me like they do in the movies. I also have this deathly fear that once I turn away and look back at the mirror, some demon would pop out at the second glance. It's because of this fear that I never take my eyes off the mirror, not even while peeing. Unfortunately, with all my attention placed on the mirror, I completely neglect the open window near the stall closest to the wall. And the second I turned my head to inspect the open window, a child's head popped out and screamed. I remember his face distinctly. He had black hair, his eyes were completely white, and his face a grayish blue. He had no scars, but his shriek was piercingly loud and high, and he was clawing for me like I was his victim. And then I woke up. I was in college at the time, and it was late at night. The day before Thanksgiving, I believe, or at least around that time. I had had class earlier in the day, and packed, then headed off on a 10-hour drive to the western edge of Nebraska. It was around 1 or 2 in the morning, and I was on the final stretch of the trip, when driving down a totally deserted highway. There were only 2 lanes with no shoulder, so the speed limit was 55. I was really tired, and having not seen anyone for at least an hour, I kept kicking up my speed to 80. I was just flying down the road. As I crested a hill, I spotted a headlight atop a couple hills down. I didn't think much of it, and reduced my speed a bit and got ready to turn off the brights over the next hill. But I didn't see any more headlights. I figured they must have turned off onto a gravel road or something. It could have been for any number of reasons. They lived that way, or maybe coming home after a night at the bar and didn't want to risk getting pulled over on the highway. But at first, I didn't think it was that weird. Until boom, a black car hauled ass past me in the direction that car had been heading, with their headlights off completely. I still wasn't too freaked out until I saw bleak lights and then the headlights behind me. I fucking hauled ass. I called my grandparents as soon as I noticed the person was gaining on me. I gave them a heads up, and my grandpa said he'd be at the end of their half-mile driveway with his shotgun and rifle waiting for me. I still had another 10 miles to go until the nearest town, then about 20 miles on gravel to get to their house. I knew the roads reasonably well, but not well enough to get off the main drag and zigzag across country roads. I was doing 90, and so was this person, but they kept their distance. I got to the town and just hauled ass through it. I didn't stop for the 2 stop signs or the 1 stoplight. At that point, I was hoping to get pulled over. As I got about a mile from my grandparents' house, my grandpa turned on his headlights and spotlight on his truck and was driving towards me. That's when the person turned back around. I always wonder what the fuck they were doing. Like, were they trying to just fuck with me? Or did they want something? I guess I'll never know. I was on I-70 in Colorado going towards Utah. I pulled over at a gas station at about 8 p.m. I was fueling up and I noticed a couple of attractive women pumping gas. On the other side was a man that looked like he was in his late 40s, just staring at these young women without notice of anything else going on around him. I walked inside to go grab some food for the next few hours of driving. When I come out, I see both the younger women's car and the older man's truck are gone. I decided to hang out at the gas station for the next hour to catch a little sleep before hitting the road again. After driving for a few hours, I was speeding heavily. I pulled over at yet another gas station. The young women are there getting gas and eating some food on a picnic table. It looked like they had been there for a while. I didn't see any sign of the man in the truck, but I can't say I was looking very hard for him. Well, here's where it all got creepy as hell. I can't say I didn't stare at them a bit. I mean, they were really good-looking women. As I'm watching them leave, I see in the next parking lot over some headlights turn on, and it's the same man as before. He leaves when the women leave once again. Okay, that's a bit weird, but could just be a coincidence as there weren't many places to pull over. I leave a few minutes later and catch up to them. Now, this guy is riding their ass with his high beams on. I decided to slow down and stay a distance behind the truck. 10 minutes or so later, the women pull over again to most likely get this guy off their ass. With a sigh of relief, the truck keeps going and I continue on my way. About 1 mile down the road, the guy just pulls off the side of the highway, so I pull off a mile or so down the road again. Sure enough, the women drive by and the guy is still following them. At this point, we are out in the middle of nowhere and too many coincidences have happened. I called the cops to alert them, and about 15 minutes later, the cops pulled the guy over. I could have just seen too many horror movies that started like this and overreacted, but you never know. Better safe than sorry. I woke up in the middle of the night and there was this man sitting on the edge of my bed. He told me to join him or I would face the consequences. I didn't know what that meant. I had this dream when I was about 10, so of course I said I wouldn't join him. He suddenly got very angry and started yelling, so I dove under my covers. When I was brave enough to peek out, he was gone, so I went to tell my parents. I walked down the hall, but it wasn't them. It was 2 completely random people sitting in my parents' bed. They told me to join them, as the man had, but I was terrified. Somehow, I knew at this point I was in a dream, and I had decided I needed to wake up. I ran back to my bed and closed my eyes hundreds of times. I woke up. Now the door to my bedroom was slightly ajar, and I could see my younger brother walking down the hallway. A light was on from the bathroom, and all I could see was the back of his head, and it looked exactly like him. So I ran to give him a hug. I was so relieved. But the boy turned around, and it wasn't my brother. So I tried again, and again, and again to wake up. It never was my actual family. It never was anyone I knew. It was so much worse than it sounds, especially since every time I, quote, woke up, it was a different stage of the night, or a different bedroom sometimes. When I actually did wake up, for real, I went to my parents' room again and saw that it was them there. I cried because I was so happy that it was over. It all started normally. I was walking around my tiny hometown with my cousin, and we visited some friends and went swimming. Then my mom and a few other people picked us up for a trip. As we started driving, the scenery was like an oil painting of desert mountains and sunset. When we arrived at our destination, it was dark. I stood with them all, looking down from a ridge and into a valley filled with pale, square houses. They were plain and looked relatively normal, if not unnervingly uniform. There was a restaurant with its lights on in the midst of the houses, so we decided to go for dinner. I lingered a little longer and for some reason could see some of the roofs of the houses, one in particular. I thought it was strange before that I couldn't see any of the people, but now in the center of this house was a little boy in a black monk-like robe with a black band across his mouth. It didn't even look like tape. It was just as if there was nothing there. Emptiness. He was wriggling. I grew unsettled and ran after my family into the valley for dinner. At the restaurant, it was filled with these black-draped people, all with black across their mouths. More emptiness. And it was silent. At the counter, I asked the chef which chicken was better, and he responded by glaring and throwing hot oil on me. One of the young men seated at the table got up and tried to yell at the chef through his covered mouth, but guards immediately came in and took him outside. I could hear the gunshots. That's when my group ran for our vehicle. When we got there, though, a man dressed in white with black across his mouth was trying to steal our car. In panic mode, I tackled him to the ground. The guards picked him up, and immediately I realized what I had done and started crying, telling him I was sorry. He ended up ripping the black from his face and was bloody and raw, and told me that it was better this way. And that's when I woke up. Okay, so I know this might be met with a ton of speculation, as this topic usually overwhelmingly receives. However, it's a true and raw experience that I've only reiterated to a few of my closest friends and husband. It was the summer of 2013. I was out with my friends about 10 miles from my home at their apartment and stayed up late with them until about 2 a.m. It's important to note that I had taken an afternoon nap the day leading up to these events from about 3 to 5 p.m., and we did not do anything other than smoke some weed and drink a little. At the time, being 20, and after having started dabbling at 17, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary to have a few drinks or a few puffs. Basically, I had a hefty tolerance and I wasn't seeing shit. I was not out of my mind is what I'm trying to say. In fact, more towards the realm of sober than anything else when the following took place. I left my friend's house after napping on her couch from 2 a.m. to just before 5 a.m. I was totally sober and just wanted to get home to my comfort zone. So I drove, sober. My parents owned a home in a lake community, so when I drove in on a back entrance road, I immediately was stirred in my usual go with the motions to a large black and oval shape in the distance over the lake. The road I was on was a hill that connects down to a road that spans the circumference of the lake community. So when I turned down onto that road, I saw this ship, as I described it, hovering about 100 feet off the lake through the tree line. As I turned right onto this road, it began following me at speed along the road as I traveled it. My parents' road was a sharp right off of it, so I gunned it going about 60 in a 25 because I felt an immediate feeling of needing to get out of the area, and I remember repeatedly muttering, "I'm going home, this is not happening, you won't take me, I'm going home," in a panic. I just sensed a really ominous feeling, and that this thing was otherworldly. Let me be clear, I've never had an encounter or experience such as this before. I made it home with no issue, but I do remember after I repeated that about 3 to 5 times, the thing disappeared from sight and I just hauled it the last quarter-mile home and raced to my room. I remember looking out of my bedroom window, which had a slight view of the lake during the winter, and seeing no evidence of the thing that just essentially chased me. Ever since, I've had other instances of awareness. No one really believes me, but I'm as steadfast in the belief of as the sky is blue, grass is green, and personally God is real. Is there anyone else? It's a shame I'm forced to answer anonymously. The following picture shows Sirius A, but during my experience, Sirius A was very close to the horizon due to the time, longitude, and latitude of the night. I was in my bed, I found myself outside of my body, and I went through the door, finding myself in the courtyard looking southwest. I was 26 years old. It was in southwest of France in a town called Angoulême. First of all, they told me they came to my place because I was on the same longitude than the region of the African tribe the Dogons in Mali. So now you know it didn't happen in the US. However, I checked and it was not on the same longitude, but I guess there is a reason. The word, to tell, is not right, but it helps explain things. They didn't speak in any language. They injected things into my head. There were several channels. One channel was what I saw through my eyes, another channel was ideas that they passed to me, and another one was the control to check to see if my body was okay. I traveled to a constellation called Canis Major. It was during the night, and in order to get there, we jumped to another dimension, and they warped the universe to reach the point. It was like taking a piece of paper with 2 points on it and folding it to get to 2 points closer. So I saw an effect like in a sci-fi movie, with a planet that got bigger, and it was close to Sirius B. Then the time started to speed up. Those memories are recorded in my mind at fast speed, just like when you speed up a movie on your video player. I don't want to do sessions to find it. I was extremely scared, and at the beginning I was so scared from what I saw that I thought I would die. I don't remember what the heads of the beings looked like, but I do remember their bodies. Their skin or clothes looked like blue plastic, and their body looked so fragile that it was strange how they could stand up on Earth at all. I wonder if my brain blacked out on their faces. I remember I talked a lot with them. It's inside my brain somewhere, but I don't want to look for those memories right now. I remember they could think extremely fast, so that when I finished a question, the answer was instant. I guess they could reflect on things 4 or 5 times faster than any human being could. I also forgot to say that I wonder whether they were made of flesh because they could be made of half energy, half tangible organs, but their uniforms were tangible. I remember they told me time could be stretched and slowed down, and it could not tick at the same pace depending on the location where you could find yourself in the universe. There was another thing I'm not sure about. It was an energy cloud. It was like a very powerful explosion, almost like a nuclear explosion frozen in time, or perhaps extremely slowed down, which allowed to provide a huge amount of controlled energy. The day after this experience, I went to an astronomy website and entered my longitude, latitude, date, and time of the previous night, and I was shocked because I saw the sky that I had seen the night before. That's how I determined I saw Canis Major with Sirius A and B. Then I checked where the Dogons were located in Mali, but it didn't match my latitude. But I remembered I told myself they have an incredibly powerful energy with no CO2 footprint and no nuclear waste. This energy is linked to their molecules. I'm sorry I don't remember more. I'm Cartesian, and I think all of this could have been created by my subconscious, but nevertheless, I've never had complex dreams in my life before now. I posted this story on a similar thread a while back. Some buddies and I went camping by the lake one night. At about 1:30 a.m., we heard some rustling in the bushes and just figured it was a rabbit or something. We went over to check it out and found nothing. But about 5 minutes later, a huge pickup truck that was lifted and blaring loud music drove by on a dirt road really slowly, shining a huge police-grade spotlight on me and my friends. The truck burned out and kept driving. So, my best friend and I decided to drive up the road and see if we spot anything unusual about the truck. We get to the main road, and there are probably 7 or 8 cop cars, lights flashing, and 2 or 3 ambulances. We stop to turn around, and, I swear, like a damn horror film, a cop pecks on my window with his flashlight out of nowhere. He asks what we're doing, and we told him we were camping and told him about the truck. He says, "Well, you boys might want to camp somewhere else. We had a homicide here and haven't located the suspect." My friend says, "So should we be scared?" Like a damn idiot. And the cop says, and I quote, "Well, I'm not scared, but there are 20 officers here and we all have guns." I said, "Yes, sir," and tore off back down the campsite. My best friend called the rest of our buddies and told them to pack up the gear, no questions asked, and that we had to get out. We literally threw 2 fully pitched tents in the back of one of our trucks and got the hell out of there. The cops located the killer about 30 minutes later. at our campsite. Last summer, I road tripped across the US solo for 2 months. I left Crater Lake heading to California later than I'd planned, and was planning to camp wherever. My gas light had been on for 30 miles and there hadn't been any services, so I was getting a little nervous. I saw a sign for a campground and I figured I could talk to whoever was camping there to find out how far away gas was and maybe sleep there for the night. It was an old logging site, so the road there was super rough and very far from the main road. I pulled in and there was a mid to late 20s couple at the very first site. I said hello and asked if they knew the area. I got a sense of genuine friendliness from them, and they told me that the nearest gas station was only 2 miles away, but that it had closed for the night. The site next to them was open, and they suggested that I take it. I started setting up my tent and was using a rock to get my stakes into the ground when the guy showed up with his hand axe and offered to help. Creepy, but helpful. I asked if he drank and offered him a beer as a neighborly gesture. His wife or girlfriend came over and asked if I had any pills. Just some ibuprofen, but why don't you have some weed I picked up in Washington? They reminded me to pay for my site at the self-serve box, more than once. This seemed like a red flag, so I said I didn't have any cash. They said I could just write my credit card information down and put it in the box. 1,000 red flags. The woman wanted to introduce me to the neighbors, so she took me to an RV that looked like it had been parked there for multiple months. Cardboard over wheels, dirty, all that. And inside was a very drunk man, somewhere over 60, a woman who insisted on feeding me the tacos she was cooking, and a dog looking at me like maybe I had food in my pockets. The drunk man started a very long story that wound up being a joke, with the punchline being Jeffrey Dahmer cannibalism based at the moment that the older woman handed me a taco. I stated I had to check on something, got the fuck out of the trailer, tossed the taco to the dog that followed me, and proceeded to crack open a beer to put together a plan. These people were messed up, but I didn't feel like I was in immediate danger, like I had some time. I decided to shoot the breeze with the guy from the first couple, and the way he described it, they'd been camping for 2 weeks because money ran out. Pretty soon, I heard the old woman yelling at the man in the "that's it, I've had it" vein. I'd stated that I was thinking about heading over to the gas station to see if it was actually closed, just so I could get a few more miles done for the day. The old lady comes over to where Dude and I were standing and says, "He's really done it this time. Next ride into town that comes my way, I'm gonna take it." I sip my beer. The younger woman says to me, "I can ride with you to the gas station just so you find it." I take a much larger sip of my beer. I'm starting to get really uncomfortable from all of this. I make up some shit excuse to go back to my site and rip up my tarp, tent, and fly altogether, shove it in the back of my car and get the fuck out of there. I made it to the gas station, which was indeed closed, but had passed a charming B&B less than a mile before. I explained to the desk clerk that I had a very weird encounter at a campsite and would be sleeping in my car in the lot for the night. She wanted to sell me a room far outside my budget and wound up offering the use of the bathrooms and morning coffee. I filled up my tank in the morning and bid farewell to that place. I'm an over-the-road truck driver, and I drive across all of the lower 48 states. I see some unusual things from time to time, but nothing compares to what I encountered in Palestine, Arkansas in mid-June of 2011. I was on a long haul from Detroit, Michigan to Houston, Texas, and this was day 3 of my trip. I was beginning to run out of driving hours for the day. I noticed a truck stop and gas station on the side of I-40, and I pulled off and decided to call it a night. I was running ahead of schedule, so I was going to have myself a long 14-hour break instead of the usual 10. Off the bat, I didn't like the area, but had no other choice. The bathrooms were unkempt, and it had enough graffiti on the walls to classify itself as an inner-city truck stop, even though I was practically in the middle of nowhere. It was also a small shop, and parking for only a dozen trucks. After washing up, I purchased a new work knife, some hot food, and headed out to my truck. I sat in the captain's chair and listened to the radio while I ate my dinner with my windows down, letting in the dry wind. The Mississippi River had just begun flooding, but there hadn't been any rain in over a week. The surrounding area was beginning to look a lot like Nevada more than Arkansas. I finished my meal and cleaned up a bit, and I slid out of the seat and onto the pavement as a gust of warm wind hit me. I strolled over to the dumpster, tossed my garbage inside, and began slowly walking back to my truck. I fished out a filterless cigarette and leaned against the bug-splattered side of my truck and lit it with my lighter. I enjoyed the smoke, and as I watched the sun set below the horizon, a few more trucks had backed into spots. I spotted one guy walking out of the store with a bottle of beer in his hand, looking around nervously as he quickly strode over to his truck. The life of a trucker. Something interesting and new every day, risking his job over one lousy beer. I climbed back into the cab of the truck, dropped back into the sleeper berth, changed into a pair of pajamas and laid down to get some rest. I didn't bother setting an alarm. I felt sleep creep over me and accepted it as I drifted off into dream world. I awoke with the cab of the truck rocking violently, knocking the bottle of water I had placed on my nightstand over onto the floor. I sat straight up, fully awake, and pressed the button on the truck's radio and alarm. It was shortly after 3 a.m. I reached down and grabbed the bottle of water that had fallen, twisted the cap off, and took a few deep gulps before wondering what had rocked my truck so violently. Then I remembered the wind. I settled back down and got my heart rate back below 100 and laid my head down onto the pillow. The truck ended up rocking again, knocking my ashtray over that I had set in the cup holder and once again tossing my water bottle onto the floor. I flipped on the overhead light, slid on my shoes, and grabbed another cigarette from my pack. I opened the curtains, sat in the captain's chair, and shut off the sleeper light. I opened the door and noticed that it had cooled down considerably. I shut off the truck, pocketed the keys, and climbed down onto the pavement to look around. At this time of night, the truck stop only had lights on around the gas station pumps, and their light could not reach the truck parking area. I looked around a moment, lit my cigarette, and then I noticed something. The wind had stopped blowing. I wondered what had caused my truck to rock so violently. An earthquake, maybe? I knew that a few had been reported around Memphis, and I was probably close enough to have felt a tremor, but that rocking motion did not feel like an earthquake. It felt like the wind hitting the side of my truck with a very strong gust. Curiously and cautiously, I walked around the front of my truck to the passenger side and looked down the length of my trailer. I noticed movement. Low to the ground, about 4 feet, not fast. I used my keys to unlock the passenger side door, jumped up and grabbed my large flashlight from an overhead storage compartment. I climbed back down and closed and locked the door. I clicked on the light and shined it down to the far side of my trailer. There was a young girl standing off into the field about 10 feet behind my truck, but when I looked harder, she wasn't there. Well, like I said earlier, truck drivers see something new every day. This was certainly new. I began to walk toward the rear of my truck, scanning the field with my flashlight for any trace of the girl I had just seen. When I reached the back, there was no trace. It must have been a trick of the eye. Heck, I haven't even fully awakened yet. I glanced over my shoulder, and there were no cars at the pumps, and the clerk definitely hadn't noticed me. I felt the call of the wild coming on and didn't feel much like walking into the store wearing my pajamas. I was in the middle of nowhere, and no one could see me, so I figured no harm, no foul. I stood at the rear of the trailer and did my business, looking around for that girl again, also hoping that she wasn't hiding behind something and watching me do this. I put everything away and walked to the driver's side of the truck again, toward the cab. I took the last couple of puffs of my cigarette and flung it into the parking lot, used my keys to unlock the truck and popped the door open. Just as I planted my foot on the fairing, I heard a distinct giggle, a girl's giggle. I stepped back down and shined the flashlight around. Once again, there was nothing. "This is getting kind of creepy," I said aloud. "He heard me," a small girl's voice answered back. I jumped backward away from my truck. The voice had come from inside the cab. Something was wrong. I had the entire truck locked up while I was walking around. There was no way that someone could have gotten in without breaking a window. Preparing myself for what was going to be an uncomfortable encounter at the least, I took a step up onto the fairing and leaned my head into the truck. "Is anyone in here?" I asked. I hit the switch to turn on the sleeper berth light and climbed in. I put a knee on the seat and peered into the sleeper berth. "Good night," a soft voice said, which seemed to emanate from all around me. I flinched as I heard the word and felt a cold chill run through my body. I slid off the seat and stood up into the cab, bumping my temple off the overhead storage bins. I looked around the sleeper, but there was no one there. I turned around and shuffled into the cab to close the door when I saw the young girl standing outside my truck on the pavement, looking up at me with lifeless eyes. Those eyes, you see, weren't meant for a person. They were designed for a predator, and all of a sudden I felt like prey. I reached forward and slammed the door shut and flicked the lock. I quickly decided that I was not staying here for the rest of the night. I turned the key and heard my truck's motor rumble to life, along with the familiar, annoying buzzing that was my air pressure's gauge telling me that I didn't have enough air to release the brakes. I took a furtive glance out the window, and there she stood, still as a tree, looking up at me and smiling. I didn't want to get any closer to the window until I was ready to get my truck moving. This was wrong, and I didn't want any part of this. That girl wasn't human. At least not anymore she wasn't. It was almost as if she was something so inhuman that it would take the form of a human. It's hard for me to explain, and I feel sick just thinking about it. I heard the siren shut off and hit the valves to supply air to my brake system. As the system began to air up, the siren came on again. Screw this, I thought to myself. I have enough to get out of here. I disengaged the clutch, ground the truck into gear, and roared out of the parking lot like the devil himself was behind me, which, for all I knew, he was. I looked in my side mirror as I was about to start turning right and saw the girl washed in the red and amber glow of my running lights. She was just smiling at me and waving. I flew through my gears as quickly as they would let me as I got back onto the interstate. I drove for about 45 minutes, repeatedly hitting the switch to turn on my interior lights to look around the cab and the sleeper before finally spotting a larger truck stop at the next exit. After backing into one of the few remaining spots left, I shut off my lights and turned on the sleeper berth light as I walked into the back, then paused. At the other store, I had bought a souvenir. Nothing fancy, just a postcard with a picture of Arkansas on it. I also had bought a new knife. I had never even taken the knife out of the box and remembered putting the postcard into the drawer for safekeeping. The point of the blade had been driven directly into the spot on I-40 where I had originally stopped for the night. The blade had been driven in deep, pegging the postcard to my nightstand. It took me several minutes just to work the knife loose enough to withdraw it from the nightstand. Thankfully, when I turned the postcard over, no message had been left for me. To this day, I do not know what I saw. I hear other truckers talk of strange things that they have seen on interstates, US highways, and state routes, but I've never mentioned my experience. I've always felt that just by mentioning her, I'd walk back out to my truck, and there she would be, sitting on my bunk and waiting for me. I threw that postcard away and tossed the knife into a dumpster. I got another postcard from Arkansas, just to keep the collection going. I've got 36 so far. I remember waking up for no reason whatsoever. No loud noise, no touching on my body that makes me wake up, just complete silence. I sat up, just thinking to myself that maybe I was really thirsty, or I had to piss or something. But there was this feeling, it was just very odd. A feeling I've never had before. I can't even explain the feeling, but certain people know this exact feeling I'm talking about. If I had to put it into words, all I would say is pure dread. I felt as if time simply didn't exist. I almost felt like the entire world just stopped. It even felt like my clock was frozen in time. I remember sitting up in a daze. As I sat up, I turned my head to the left of me, looking out of my bedroom doorway. As I peeked through, I saw a man standing there just staring back at me. He had to be around 7 feet tall, and I'm not even joking here. This man wasn't hollow-looking at all. No ghostly look. He looked like a human, completely solid, just standing there staring at me. I remember seeing the details in the clothes and everything. He had on all black boots, kinda like Doc's, faded blue jeans, and a huge puffy jacket. Very odd, since it was the middle of summer, and even at night it can still be very warm in California. The jacket had a hood that was over his head. The odd thing is that I could not see his face at all. Even with the dim blue light lighting him up, his face was just black. No facial features or anything. Just a complete dark void where his face was supposed to be. As I sat there staring at him, I was just frozen. Not making a sound, I was washed over with this confusing feeling mixed with fear. I remember both of us just looking at each other for what seemed like minutes, but was most likely only about 30 seconds. As I was looking at him, I just felt terrified. I remember all of a sudden just knocking out. I was staring at him and then just slowly laid back down. Then nothing, just KO'd instantly. Complete darkness. When I was around 8 years old, approximately 1995, I went to visit a friend's house just up a path and through a court from my house, about a minute away. On the court is a set of flats which creates an archway that you have to walk through. As I walked back home and through that archway, I heard a low humming noise and look over my shoulder to see a typical film-like shaped spaceship. You know, the round disc-like shape with the dome on top, with circular lighting. The lights didn't shine as such, as it was daytime, but I can only now explain them as looking like LED lights, which is why they were so noticeable in the daylight. The UFO was small, no bigger than about 3 feet and 1.5 feet in height. I think it was coming for me. At this point, I'm so scared and I started running for home. I'm about 30 seconds away and the corner to the path is just coming up. I'm still trying to watch this thing chase me, and as I get to the corner, it's just behind me, and the low humming noise is deafening. I can feel it within me. I have to take my eyes off of it for a second to turn the corner, and as I do, the light, whether it was natural sunlight or the LED type lights, went really bright and it sounded like a jet plane thundering overhead. I look up. As I round the corner, it's above my head, so close the wind it created whipping up my hair. Then, just as it had suddenly appeared, it disappeared. There was no visual sign of it, but I heard that jet plane noise and low humming noise move further and further away from me. As I get home and tell my mom and dad, they don't believe me or say I must have been mistaken. They thought it was a bird or something, I guess. I told my friend the next day and she rolled on the floor laughing. I stopped telling people after that, but I can still remember it like it was yesterday, and I still can't shake the feeling that it was coming for me, even though it was so small. I don't think I would have fit inside of it. My wife, dog, and myself, second day of an 80-kilometer hike in northern Ontario. It was around Killarney Provincial Park. We set up camp on a point 750 meters into a lake. One way onto the point and one way off the point. We were hearing wolves since about 9 p.m. and we went to bed by 10 and the howls were getting closer and closer. Then one howled right from behind us on the trail down to the point. I got out of the tent and started making lots of noise trying to scare it off. This usually works for bears, whom we have had lots of encounters with. I didn't see anything there and didn't hear anything else either. I went back to bed and laid down, trying to act confident to not upset my wife. Then, when we both heard something outside of the tent, my dog was crazy quiet but shaking. I opened the tent to find a wolf staring at me from about 15 feet away. I grabbed the bear spray and took aim. I didn't use it, but I again started screaming at the wolf and took a few charges towards it. Again, this usually works when faced with a black bear if you have no escape. The wolf didn't seem to really care, though, that I was yelling at it. It kind of hung out for a few seconds, then kind of very casually walked into the tree line just far enough that I couldn't see it anymore. I built a fire between the tent and the bush, sat up, and kept my headlamp on all night. I had to listen to 3 or 4 wolves howl to each other all night about every 20 minutes. They were very close. The one I would estimate to be within 50 yards. I was sure they were going to come and grab my dog. At about 6 a.m., a bunch of them started howling all together way more than during the night, but it sounded like 8 to 10 wolves. We waited until about 8 a.m., then packed up and got the fuck out of there. We were 36 kilometers in, and it took us 2 days to hike in. We hiked out in 6.5 hours. About 1.5 hours into our hike out, the wolves started howling behind us again. They were still following us. On the hike out, we saw a bear with 2 cubs. This would usually concern us a bit, but we were just wanting to get the fuck out of there. My wife lost all of her toenails from the hike, and my poor dog got some serious anxiety about being in the tent. I was camping with 2 college friends way the hell out in the mountains of Trinity County in far northern California. It wasn't an established campsite, just a nice spot many miles down a dirt road off the main highway Route 299, which is largely isolated to begin with. There might not have been another soul for miles. This is a very rural and rugged area, and it's part of a region where a lot of weed is cultivated illegally, which can sometimes make it dangerous. We got to this spot late in the day, a nice little clearing along a stream, and set up camp. As we sat around the fire after dark, shooting the shit like usual, a large animal suddenly exploded out of the brush and seemed to stop right outside our fire circle. But then we didn't hear it leave. Not even a twig cracking. It was gone though. We searched all around with our lights. It seemed very unusual to all of us that this animal would arrive so loudly. We listened to it approach for several oh shit seconds, but then make no discernible noise retreating. My one friend, who was sort of a local, said he thought it was a puma for that reason. A tad unnerving, but okay. We laughed it off, drank beer, and eventually crashed out, with one friend and I in a 2-person tent and the other, the local who grew up in the backwoods, in a tiny single-person tent next to us. We fell fast asleep for at least a few hours. Out of nowhere in the middle of the night, I woke the fuck up. There were several footsteps right outside of our tents. I don't know why, but I felt a very strong intuition not to call out to my friend in the other tent to check if it was him, even though him going out to take a piss would be the obvious explanation. I'd gone camping with these guys countless times. And then, the person walking called out, and I almost shat myself. It wasn't my friend. It was just some random guy. He circled our tents for the next 5 minutes calling, "Hello? Hello?" He said it over and over in a disconcerting, calm, and measured voice. Remember, this was in the middle of the night, way the fuck out in the middle of nowhere. I had this crazy gut feeling to stay absolutely silent and wait for an attack, which I did, knife in hand. My friend in my tent slept through it all. The weird guy left no sound of a vehicle or anything, and somehow dawn arrived. The next day, the first thing I did was ask my buddy in tent number 2 whether he heard that dude walking around, and he did. He had the same instinct as me. My other friend, who had been sleeping next to me, was obviously confused. He said, "What the fuck? Why didn't you wake me up? It's like we'll help the guy out or kick his ass." I couldn't explain it, but the other friend backed me up right away. He said it was super creepy, and the way the guy was moving and speaking had a really weird vibe. This friend wasn't the type to get scared or the type you would expect not to confront someone in that situation. So my tent mate just let it be, and we all just basked for a few minutes in the WTF-ness of it all. One of the little mysteries of my life that I always look back on is what that guy wanted and what would have happened if we had responded or, burst out of our tents. It's not easy to burst out of a zipped up tent, and who knows, maybe in that case the little hung up saved our asses. I had an experience about 15 years ago which up until now I thought was supernatural in nature. It wasn't until I saw an episode of a TV show about aliens that described events that took place on an island in Brazil in the 1970s that I started to question the nature of my experience. People living on the island were attacked by glowing balls. My experience was very similar. Now, I believe that it was an alien encounter. I've never told anyone, ever, about this experience, but it was just too weird and hard to describe. I will do my best. Firstly, the reason I thought the experience was supernatural was because at the time I was participating in a healing group, and we were experimenting with multiple energy healing modalities in prayer, so I thought this was related to that activity. Anyway, late one night, I was awakened by a buzzing in my room. There were no lights in the room other than the glowing ball. It looked like 1,000,000 tiny fireflies. The ball was measured about 1/3 of a meter or 18 inches in diameter. It was flying around my bedroom, bouncing off the walls in an irregular pattern. Then, suddenly, the ball came towards me, very quickly, and hit me directly in the chest. It hit me so hard that I fell back on the bed. The feeling I had was just like when your foot falls asleep, pins and needles and very intense. My mind struggled between wondering whether I should relax and allow this to happen, or struggle and fight back. After about 5 minutes, I came to the decision, and the clear thought was, I want to live. It erupted in my consciousness. As soon as I had that thought, which somehow felt like it came physically out of my heart, the ball of light left me and the bedroom. I've never been visited by it again. Also, I was living near the sea, just like the Brazilians on the island affected by the attacking of balls of light. However, my experience was not harmful. Perhaps they've adjusted the strength of their alien X-rays. Seriously, I don't know what it was, but the experience was very real. I hope this has helped someone understand their experience better. I was walking through a thick cloud of smoke. I looked around me to find Native Americans smoking from their pipes, and I breathed the smoke into my lungs. As I walk, I come to a fire. It felt like a celebration or ceremony was about to take place, and there stood a great man with a long headdress of beautiful feathers. He handed me a small axe and showed me a pig lying on the ground. I could not understand him, but I knew what he wanted me to do, and I just couldn't do it. I didn't want to kill this pig. I threw the axe across the fire, and it transformed into a sword and struck into the ground. I was ashamed. I walked over to the sword and grabbed the blade, but the chief walked over and took my arm to lead me to a teepee of all different colors nearby. I heard a man singing inside, and the chief left me there outside of the teepee. I remember being scared to go in. As I gathered the courage and made my way inside, he stopped singing and looked at me, and then the blood dripping from my hand. Others that were there began leaving, and he showed me the seat next to him, as if telling me to sit down. He poured earth into my wound, and then handed me a small brown leather bag. Inside was a necklace with a red rock. I left him, and the others were waiting outside. I went off by myself and stared at this necklace. After a while, I put it on and made my way back out to the fire. The chief saw me and my new necklace, and I had a sense that this should not be mine. The chief spoke, and everyone listened. They all got up and started to dance, moving the earth. I couldn't help it, but I started to dance too. I danced as hard as I could, not caring of anything else. It was getting really late, and they started to leave one by one, but I kept dancing and dancing until I fell to the ground in exhaustion. As I woke up, it was still dark. The fire was still strong, and I gazed across the fire to see the shaman sitting there staring at me. He gets up with grace and stands with his back to me. He turns around as if asking me to follow him, and walked away. I quickly followed behind. The sun was starting to come up by the time we reached the river, and then he spoke to me, and he could speak English. He told me that water is life. He explained that water had no great beauty or didn't smell like a flower, but yet the flowers and all the wonders of life depend on its presence. He jumped into the water and looked like a colorful fish swimming in the light. I jumped in after him, and as we came up for air, I was laughing. The water felt so good. He took some in his hands for me to drink, and it was the best water I'd ever tasted. We left the river and began walking through the grassy meadows nearby. He stopped to pick up some of the dirt and laid it in my hands. I let it run through my fingers, and I buried my feet in the dirt and laid down in it, burying my hands in as well. I realized there is a value in all things from this. I was just lying there with my hands and feet in this cool dirt. The shaman walked over and then shut my eyes, and that's when I woke up. I've spent the past 4 years driving every night for work. I was in a fairly rural part of Mississippi, somewhere between Clarksdale and Greenwood, where it's all 2-lane highways the 250-mile drive home. The weather had turned pretty sour as I was leaving Clarksdale. I called my wife and told her there were high wind advisories and very possible tornado threats, and I'd call her as soon as I made it to a safe area again. I had already been working for 14 hours when I got in the truck, so I ate dinner and grabbed some coffee to stay awake and alert. Now, if you've ever driven through a flat farmland at night for 100 miles, it's very fatiguing and spooky even without bad weather. I had maybe driven 30 miles out into this farmland when hail started bouncing off my truck. In July, hail means tornado, and I knew it. I pull off to the side with no one around me and start looking for the storm or tornado I believe to be approaching. I rolled the passenger window down and shone a bright flashlight off into the night. There was nothing there. I turned to the driver's side, and this guy has his face pushed against my glass, grinning from ear to ear. It was a tall male, very, very pale white. Eyes were sunk back quite a bit, but that grin is what truly got me. It was corner to corner with crooked teeth like the Cheshire Cat. Then I screamed, and he was gone. I slammed the truck in drive and took off at the highest speed I could go. Now, my company has a camera installed into my truck, so even though I called my wife and didn't tell her about the guy or the hail, I made darn sure I checked my SD card the moment after I hung up. I promise you, this guy never popped up on my front or rear cameras. I've always played it off as my imagination, but I will say I don't drive through the Delta in the dark anymore if I don't absolutely have to. I don't really know if I camp enough to answer this, or if it's the strange that you're looking for, but one year my friend invited me to stay up in the woods at this old campsite he went to every year with his family. It was fun. We fished and went swimming and everything. And one night we had this little bonfire and made s'mores. You know, the normal camping stuff. But then, at 2 a.m, someone whistled the Hunger Games call. Me, being an avid whistler, one of my few skills, whistled the return call. They did it again. I did it again. The campsite had maybe 40 people in it, and everyone was intense except for me and my friend and the whistler. So this went on for about 5 minutes, and the whistles devolved into random noises and counter melodies until I got fed up and decided to find them. So I stood up and walked into the forest, barefoot, no flashlight, a total fool. Now, I didn't want to call out to them because that would be too easy, so instead I slunk through the forest quietly, trying to hone in on the whistle. It took about 20 minutes before my friend realized we were going too far away from camp and should head back, but I had to frickin' find them. A couple of minutes later, we reached a little clearing. There was a cliff that ran down into the lake and a couple of trees that had fallen over, and there were 3 kids just sitting out looking at the lake. I called to them, saying that I'd been looking for them and how fun the whistling was, and who they were, but they didn't respond. They just sat there and looked at the lake. It was positively eerie, and they didn't even seem to hear me. I didn't want to get any closer to them than a couple of feet, and I especially didn't want to spook them and have them demon throw me over the cliff or something. As soon as we got back to our campsite, there was no more whistling. Very creepy. In the morning I asked people if they had heard us, and they said no, so I guess everyone is just a super heavy sleeper or something. I made an account just to tell this story. I'm from the Iroquois Reservation in Ontario, Canada. It's almost like you can ask anyone from around here if they've experienced any kind of paranormal stuff, and they usually have a story to tell. My culture and heritage is filled with stories of otherworldly beings and creatures, and stories of how things came to be before Europeans inhabited the territory. I'm naturally skeptical about a lot of what people say they see out here in the bush, as I've hunted the territory my entire life. I've come across a lot of things in the bush some might consider paranormal, like various animal cries and howls, owls flying at low light, decomposing animals in the water, etc. This particular time, though, I wasn't hunting. My family homestead is situated almost a half kilometer into the bush. It was early summer just as the fireflies were coming out. A belief of the Iroquois is that fireflies are a sign that Indian medicine is at its most powerful this time of year, good and bad. So I get home from work a little after midnight. I turn off the car and get out to start walking up the path to the house. Normal routine. This night, though, I stop to look at the fireflies up on the hill behind my home. It looks absolutely amazing. So my porch wraps around the house, and I walk to the back of the house and start walking slowly up the hill. All of a sudden, I think I hear some beating sound like music, and I look back to see if my car radio was still on. From a distance, I could see the car was off and no sound was coming from that direction. So I walk up to the top of the hill, and that's when the sound gets louder. I start to hear it clearly. From the top of the hill looking down onto the other side into the bush line, I no longer see any fireflies. All I hear is the faint sound of a water drum beating, and a low, raspy voice singing an old Indian song. I just turned around and went inside and tried to convince myself I wasn't crazy. It was the only spiritual experience I've ever had in my entire life, and I go out back to that spot every summer and lay down tobacco and cedar for my visitor. I was driving a flatbed and picked up a load of construction material. I strapped everything down, put a tarp over the load, and left. About 5 miles down the road, in the middle of nowhere, I noticed my tarp flapping in the wind. I found a wide shoulder and pulled over to fix it. I realized that I had done a bad job tarping this load the first time and decided to redo it on the side of the road. I undo all the bungee straps, drag the tarps off, roll them back up, climb up onto the load, and start unrolling the tarps again. That's when I see a guy walking down the same side of the road that I'm on, coming towards my truck. I don't think anything about it other than to keep an eye on him, because I'm in the middle of nowhere, and I continue what I'm doing. About the time I have the tarps set in place and I'm climbing down to start hooking the bungee straps back on, this dude is getting close enough that I'm now paying more attention to him than I am tarping my load. I grab my winch bar and set it on the trailer where I'm working just in case. The guy gets to me, and the first thing I notice is his hair. It's like a mullet, but it's patchy. Like he tried to cut his own hair and he had a seizure in the process. The next thing I noticed were his eyes, which I can only describe as off. Like they were clear and he had seemed sober, but they also gave me the distinct impression that the elevator didn't go all the way up. His clothes were dirty and not well maintained, with dirty white tennis shoes. I remembered he didn't have laces on one shoe, and the tongue was noticeably out of place. He stops by me and waits until I acknowledge him. His words made me shiver. He just says, "I've got a long walk." I'm like, "Yeah man, you do, we're in the middle of nowhere," making it clear there's no ride to be had here. He nods, starts walking by me, continuing on his way. Then he stops at about the driver door of my truck and turns around, comes back to me and repeats himself, "I've got a long walk." At this point, I explained explicitly that I can't give him a ride, insurance and all of that. I apologize for not being able to help him out, and he seems to accept this, turns around and leaves. I wait for him to get a little ways away from my truck and start working on finishing the tarp job. I still keep an eye on him, and he keeps moving away from me. As I'm putting on the last of the bungee straps, I look over to check where he's at, and he's turned around heading back towards me. He's now about 100 yards in front of my truck and coming back my way. It looks like he's talking on a cell phone. He has his hand up to his face, and I can barely make out his mouth moving. Meanwhile, his other hand is waving like he's having a conversation with someone. I finish with the straps, grab my winch bar, and am climbing back into the truck as he's about 10 yards away now. As soon as I'm in the cab, I lock the doors and set the winch bar on the passenger seat just in case. I look at the guy and realize he's not talking on a phone. He's just talking to his hand. Now I'm really nervous because he doesn't look like he's having a nice, pleasant chat. It looks more like an angry conversation. I crank the truck up, put it in gear, and just pull out. Didn't look for traffic or anything. As I pass him, he's just looking at me, still holding his hand to his face and just staring at me. It gave me the creeps. About the time I hit 5th or 6th gear, I look in the mirror, and there's no one there. The air was fresh, but I had no need to breathe. I had opened my eyes and I felt the comfort of a new place that felt like home. A being of energy talked to me, and he felt loosely human. He walked me down a pathway, and we passed a giant garden with a large cross. It was very simple, but the garden was vibrant, even with the cloudy glow. I was walked up some stairs and taken closer to the giant hall at the end of the path. I noticed that I had felt nothing. No pain, no worry, no doubt, as if the thing I followed I had known my whole life. I looked down at my body and noticed that my scars and tattoos were gone. We stepped into a hall of hundreds of people. The being then spoke to me without having to speak with a body. I was told I passed in my sleep, and that I had come to terms with my passing. I felt like I was deeply saddened, but all I wanted to do was try to contact my family and let them know heaven existed. But then the being spoke to me and said there aren't many rules, but speaking to the living is not allowed. I had no longer had a way of talking to my loved ones and friends, and it hurt so bad, but the being assured me that we'd all have a way to meet once they passed, and this is where. He gave me options. I could visit past relatives or friends who are gone, and talk to the people in the common area. I then asked around about anyone knowing how to contact the living, but everyone said we can't do that. That's not how it works here. So I began to accept it, and just started talking to the being, and he said I can do anything on Earth here, just can't contact the living. I wondered, and didn't speak to anyone, but saw the endless hall filled with people, and couldn't shake the feeling I wanted to talk to the living. I was on the way to talk again with the being that I had met when I got here, and I could hear a voice call to me. It was louder than all the noise in the room. It was my dad's voice. He was yelling for me to wake up, and when the being saw I could hear it, he came to me instantly and told me to ignore it. I could feel my body again slowly as I took in the noise, and the creature kept yelling at me not to listen. I woke up, and to this day can remember the feeling of all the air return to my lungs and the pain in my body come back as I woke up. I can't shake the feeling I died in my sleep that night. Although I've never been face to face with an alien themselves, I've seen an alien ship before. In the summer of 2006, around 9 p.m., I was driving with an employee down a one-lane road in the northeast corner of New Jersey, in an area considered part of Mahwah, but in the middle of nowhere. We were delivering furniture, but we were a bit lost in a rural area of private unnamed roads. I was looking for a place where I could turn around with the trailer I was pulling, when the forest around us suddenly got bright as if it were daytime. I stopped the van, very confused. We looked up and saw a triangle-shaped craft maybe 50 feet up moving very slowly, less than 20 miles per hour. The lights on the craft were definitely too small to light up the forest like that, but the light was definitely coming from the aircraft. The craft made a robotic sound as it lit up the inside of the cab of the van, simultaneously scanning me and my employee. I don't know how else to describe it, but we were definitely their focus for about 2 seconds, during which they scanned us for some sort of informational purpose, I guess. As soon as they lit up the cab, we both knew that they wanted to know more information about us. It didn't hurt, nor was there a physical feeling of the scan. Then the craft just zipped away, accelerating faster than would be possible for any Earth aircraft. When it went away, and my employee and I assured each other of what we both had just seen, I looked at my phone and saw 90 minutes of missed calls from the customer. The whole encounter with the alien craft from the moment the forest lit up to the time it zipped away lasted about maybe 15 seconds. We found her house and she was very angry since it was now very late. We unloaded her furniture and then just drove back to NYC in silence. I've posted this before, but it didn't get much love, so here it is again. I was 13 at my grandfather's hunting camp. My uncle had just bought a new hunting camera and wanted to test it out, so he set it up out in the woods. I got the brilliant idea to go up in the woods with my 2 other cousins and moon it, so when he checked the card, instead of seeing wildlife, he would see some lovely butt cheeks. Hilarious to a 13-year-old's mind, and after some convincing, my other 2 cousins were in as well, but we had to go under the cover of darkness. So we set our alarms for 3 a.m. and pass out. By 3:15, we all sneak outside, throw on our headlamps and start walking. We know the camera is about a mile away. The trail goes over 2 pretty big hills, and the camera is in a valley on the other side of the second hill. We start walking as normal, and everything is good. The excitement starts building, and we're all pretty giddy that we're about to pull this glorious prank. After a few minutes of brisk walking, we get to the top of the second hill. My older cousin, who knows the area more than me, stops as he gets to the top. As I make my way to the top myself, I see why. Off in the distance, about 400 yards, is a spotlight. Its bluish-white color illuminates nearly half of the hill at its point. This thing was crazy bright. By this time, all 3 of us were looking at the light, and my older cousin tells us to turn off our headlamps. We stand there in silence. Me, being the 13-year-old pussy I was, started to get freaked out. Aliens is the first thing that comes to my mind, and I tell my oldest cousin we have to leave. I turn on my headlamp again and turn around about to head back to the campsite. As soon as I turn my headlamp back on, the super bright blue light starts to slowly turn and stops right on us. No bobbing or movement from the light besides just a slow, constant pan right over towards our direction, just inching as slowly as possible. At that point, I nope the fuck out, with my cousins right behind. I get inside and go straight to bed, pretty much freaking out. Flash forward to the next morning, all three of us go back to the same spot, and then proceeded to go down where we thought the light would have been, and there was nothing there. No boot marks, no light, no nothing. To this very day, I still have no idea what it was. This was just a couple of weeks ago. I was camping with my sister in a state park, and for privacy we had to pick a spot away from the road and near a bit of drop in the terrain that was separated from our site by a couple of downed trees. I was having problems getting to sleep because it was cold and I had a headache. This was later in the season than we normally would have camped, and my sleeping bag was only rated to 40 degrees. It was in the mid-30s. It was about 3 a.m., and I was trying to get warm and find a position that wouldn't aggravate my headache. I heard something moving outside. There had been a bit of wind earlier in the evening, and things had been dropping from the trees. However, the wind was dead quiet now. I could hear every leaf crunch, so I knew there was something out there. My mind was racing and my body was shaking, from cold and fear. Was it a squirrel? No, they weren't nocturnal. Was it a bear? I didn't hear anything breathing. Then I heard the scratching. I was trying to be very still because whatever it was very close. I didn't want to alert it to my presence. It wasn't easy since I was shaking so hard. More leaf crunches and more scratching. Then I heard the lid being pried off the tub we had outside. I knew that it was a raccoon. Now confident that it wasn't a bear, I banged on the side of the tent several times to scare it off. My sister bolted awake as I heard the tub lid tumble and more leaf crunches as it took off. After I explained to my sister what had happened, I gathered the courage to venture out to check the damage. I replaced the tub lid and found an empty hot dog bun wrapper, missing the 2 buns. There were also small holes in the garbage bag we had hanging up in a tree, but no spillage since it was double bagged. As I was surveying the area for any other damage, I could hear leaves rustling down below. I shined my flashlight down the hill to see if I could see the bandit. That's when I saw a man in a black beanie walking down the hill in the pitch black with no flashlight about 35 feet from me. I was too scared to do anything but return to the tent and try to slow my racing heart down. Back in the 80s, I was on a long barefoot hike in the Cumberland Mountains with my friend Scott. He rode me there on the back of his Ducati, and then we scaled a canyon, climbed a mountain, and watched the sunset. On the night hike back down at the top of Rainbow Falls, we saw across the creek, Middle Creek, a glowworm glowing by a cliff. We crossed Middle Creek straight to it and checked it out. A few seconds later, Scott saw the UFO, and then I saw it as well. He freaked out, and I tried to calm him down, but when the UFO moved towards us, we both screamed like chimpanzees. I remember being so freaked. It got to about 30 feet away and was glowing white like a tube light. It was about 10 feet wide, shaped like Saturn. We were stuck in place, screaming wildly. Then a front porch swing appeared on a flat rock, and a down-angled spotlight across Middle Creek. It was like morphine. We completely calmed down and were saying, "Oh, it's just a front porch swing. It's just a swing." I went from being the most freaked out that I'd probably ever been to completely calm in 1 second. I remember stepping into the creek and helping Scott down so he could sit on the swing. At that point, my memory splits. The next thing I know, we're making the dangerous night climb down the cliffs around the falls, knowing nothing of a UFO. Only about 6 months later did I start having flashbacks to what had happened, but of course I told no one. 2 years after that, I ended up telling my friend Sheldon. He said he knew someone with the same story. He introduced me to Joe, and Joe said he was on Middle Creek at night with a friend, and they saw a glowworm off the trail. They went to it and then saw a strobe burst, and when they got back to their car, it was hours later than it should have been. He said later that he started having flashbacks as well, but his memories took him on to the craft and included sperm extraction. If I hadn't met Joe and heard the same story, same creek, same year, you would have never have read this because I wouldn't have believed it. I went on a 16-mile hike in Arizona and climbed up a pretty easy hill. I think it was about 8,000 feet to the top and not that much gain to get there. Rookie move, I didn't have enough water for the dry altitude and my meals were freeze-dried. I hiked to the top and got there as the sun was going down. I checked my water and split some between my dog and I, and then set up a quick camp near a log. It just had a small hobo fire and a place to get some sleep so I could hike back in the morning. I didn't want to be hungry, thirsty, and wandering around in the dark because it was completely new to me, even though this was just a day hike. I had never been there before. At about 10 p.m., when it's pitch black, I hear something rustling around and making low noises getting closer, making more grunts and shuffling noises and scaring the shit out of me. I had a knife on me, but I was still pretty scared. That's really not that much protection, and I'm not Daniel Boone. And now terrified, thinking it was Bigfoot or a bear or something, I started freaking out a little bit. Mountain lions don't make noise like that. My dog was staring intently in its direction with his ears up as it got closer and closer, louder and louder. As soon as it got about 10 to 15 feet away, I couldn't see because there wasn't a moon, my dog finally did his damn job and got up and started barking like crazy. And then the beast let out a huge squeal of some sort and ran away. It was just a stupid javelina that I was terrified of and stole my man card for a little bit. This was years and years ago when I was just getting back into hiking, and now I always have enough water and plan my hikes accordingly. My vicious dog is now 13 and doesn't hike anymore, but he still does guard well against the vacuum. I went backpacking into the wilderness alone this summer. Things were uneventful, and I intentionally went to a place where people didn't tend to go. But just before dark, I heard the voices of two men muttering. No matter what I did, I couldn't see them. But I was trying to be discreet myself, so that they didn't see me either, a young girl just chilling in the wilderness completely by myself. Anyway, I never tracked down those voices, and they continued until just after nightfall. I armed myself with my weapons, made my dinner, had a fire, and went to bed. I didn't hear anything again until about 4 a.m. At that time, I began to hear the sound of what I can only describe as a baseball bat or a thick branch being hit up against a tree trunk. It happened over and over and over again in a distinct pattern until the sun came up. It came from the same exact spot as where I heard those voices, but again, I never saw anything. The next day, I'm telling my coworker about it. He's an avid outdoorsman who writes published works about backpacking in the region. He knows everything about this place. He's a logical, serious man not prone to fanciful ideas at all. He asked if anything happened, and I told him that. I finished with, "It must have been a deer rubbing its antlers on a tree, right?" He looked at me dead in the eyes and told me it sounds like what I heard was Bigfoot tree knocking. He then told me that for decades, he's been told about area sightings and encounters with a Bigfoot type of creature. This happened about half a mile away from where I was. Great. So, it was either two creepy men fucking with me, or the New York Bigfoot. Either way, creepy and uncool. I think the worst creepy thing that ever happened to me was when I was heading from Arizona to Utah. This was a few years ago, and the main highway had been taken out in a flash flood. It was under construction, so I had to take a weird detour through the mountains in lower Utah. It was getting late and I was getting tired, so I pulled off onto the shoulder and went to sleep in my bunk. Now, this was in the middle of nowhere. The closest town was like 40 miles away, so it had been completely pitch black outside once I turned the lights off. Around 4 a.m., I wake up because I'm hearing something messing with my truck, like playing with the air and power cables between my cab and the trailer, which is literally 6 inches from where my head is at, outside of the cab. Then, I feel something climb onto the landing that's on the back of my truck. It shakes my whole truck, so I'm guessing something around 200 pounds was climbing around back there. I'm thinking like a mountain lion or a bear. At this point, I'm wide awake, and I want to get this thing away from me. so I slam my hand into the cab wall trying to scare whatever is out there. The response made me jump out of my skin. I hear someone, a male, scream, and I hear them fall off the back of my truck. I then hear about 15 other people all around my truck yelling. I climb up front, turn on my lights, and illuminate a squad of Army reserves doing their midnight march and capture drills. Turns out these guys were supposed to go find a abandoned truck and secure it for their midnight drills. That truck was 3 miles back down the road. They were not expecting me to be sleeping there and thought I was part of the drill. I'm ex-military, so after explaining I was not part of their tests and I was just there out of a coincidence, we all laughed it off. They had to radio to their commanding officer and tell them to not have the other squads bother me. Be warned, the content you are about to read is highly graphic. Being a part of an Italian class titled Dante's Inferno by day, at nightfall a few nights ago I fell into my own inferno. As my eyelids began to fall and my imagination began to drift, I found myself standing in front of a dark forest, unaware of my surroundings. Once I entered, I did not know I was dreaming, but merely thought I was in the very midst of hell itself, having recognized this scene from the poem I had been reading in class. The figure that replaced Dante Alighieri's guide in my own dream, however, was none other than my Italian professor. I had so many things that I had to ask him that I was thinking about in the moment, but as soon as I opened my mouth, another thought came out. Did I do badly on the midterm? As I'm on the verge of descending into my own hell, this is all I can think about. I really must be the typical Stanford student. As I reach the gates of hell with my guide, I realize that this hell is not just for those who have committed serious sins against God and others, but also my own ideals of what hell is in itself. As I enter the first level, I see a large group of students in an eerie setting, all reading some sort of book that I cannot see the cover of. This, said my professor, is the circle of IHUM, where those who do not do well are sent and forced to write IHUM papers for the rest of eternity. Phew, I thought to myself, good thing I did well in IHUM. I descend into the lower level of hell, and I am faced with a desert setting. The sands littered with blue and gold paint. The people in this level are those false worshippers, said my guide. They do not follow what is right and good. I noticed these people had Go Bears burned into their flesh, as real-life bears were chasing them in a constant circle. Is this some kind of joke? I thought to myself. I quickly realized my thoughts were not silent, as my professor says to me, "This is real, and this is a place you do not ever want to be." We began to descend lower into the depths when I noticed a small group of people in a ditch, reading the very poem that I was studying in class at the time. "What sins did these people commit?" I asked. He responded, "These unfortunate souls were those who did not pass my midterm. Unfortunately, you are destined to join them." As he pushes me into the depths, and I see the inferno climbing nearer, I wake up. Fortunately, my nightmare was merely anxiety, for even though I was destined to join them, those who did not pass the midterm, I did in fact receive a high grade. Thank God my nightmare was only in my dream. I was a security policeman stationed at Minot and worked in the missile fields of North Dakota. There were several incidents of friends having encounters with UFOs. They had reported things like cattle looking like an autopsy to UFOs going over their campers at missile silos. One day I was riding back from a missile site with my supervisor. He told me there was a UFO that had landed, and the Air Force, state troopers, and sheriff deputies had it on lockdown. He said that he had seen it, and it was on the way back to base, the way we were headed. I asked if we could stop by, and he said sure. Sure as shit, as we were coming close to the main road heading to Canada, he pulled onto a gravel entrance, and there it was. It was long, cylinder-shaped like a cigar. It was dark, so they had lights shining on it. Only the center section was visible. There were people dressed like cops, and some were in military uniform. Two guys approached. One guy said to my supervisor, "I told you to never come back." My supervisor then told him that I insisted that we stop. I asked the man if I could go on board. The other man told me that everyone who went on board had to have an injection so they didn't remember what they had seen. I said, I want to go on board. I'll take the injection. They took me over to a table, which I had to sign some papers, and I still don't remember what the papers said. The administrators talked about giving me the shot. One official did not want me to take the shot because it caused strokes and dementia around the age 50, and the government would have to pay me disability. He asked why I wanted to go on board, and I wouldn't remember anything. I told him it would be in my subconscious. After much debate, they agreed to let me go on board. They gave me the shot and said it would take effect in about 20 minutes. He instructed his staff to get me off board before that. I walked up to the aircraft. It had rivets like an old aircraft and portholes like a Navy ship. I started up the steps. The next thing I remembered was being back in my supervisor's truck. He told me to wake up and look out the window. I looked up and there was the UFO flying about 100 feet over our heads. I started to open the door to get a better look, but my supervisor grabbed me and told me he was doing 70 miles per hour. I could see a cockpit or some lights on the UFO's side. The aircraft made a quick stationary 90-degree turn, going the same direction we were going, and then took off like a rocket, with no engine flames. My supervisor told me I could not report it. He said the airbase would think I was crazy and would mentally discharge me, so I kept my mouth shut. I heard reports the next day that the aircraft security police on Minot reporting seeing a UFO. A week later, a C-130 tanker aircraft exploded on base. The Air Force aircraft cops said there was a UFO hovering above it before it blew. The Air Force blamed it on the crew member, saying he forgot to connect a static line and static electricity caused it to blow. I've now thought about this for 40 years. I wonder if those were really state troopers, deputies, and Air Force personnel at the UFO site, or could they have been some foreign personnel working on the downed aircraft, or even aliens dressed as humans themselves? Could this have been a downed foreign aircraft or a UFO? I guess I'll never know, but now, yes, I've had a stroke and do have some dementia, maybe caused by the injection. I know my story is true, and it was the strangest thing to ever happen to me in my 20 years at the Air Force. Be careful, they may be out there. Where I live, there are huge swaths of forest and land that is miles and miles from any sort of civilization. Being a good old country boy, I spent a lot of time camping along the DNR roads. One year, we camped out on the side of a little mountain and spent the night drinking and whatnot. The next morning, nobody wanted to cook, so we decided to drive into town, approximately 20 miles away, for breakfast. As we were exiting the forest, we came upon a police blockade. The sheriffs had their AR rifles pointed at us and told us to park the vehicle and walk towards them with our hands in the air. We followed instructions and they told us that a forest ranger had been shot the previous night. I later found out that she was shot about 300 feet below our campsite. We probably heard the gun, but in that part it wasn't unusual for people to be shooting in the area. We were told that we couldn't go back for our camp gear as the killer was still on the loose. Instead, we drove to a nearby casino and got back to the revelry. A few hours later, the gas station next to the casino is packed with sheriffs, PD, FBI, every LEO within 50 miles must have been there. As it turns out, the killer was spotted at the gas station, and an officer who happened to be there recognized him. When the LEO told him to get on the ground, the killer reached for his gun, at which point the LEO shot and killed him. It was so strange that we were within a few hundred feet of where he had killed someone, and hours later a few hundred feet from where he was ultimately killed. We drove back to our campsite that night a little sombered, and proceeded to get shit-faced.